It is the single most radioactive text in the Judeo-Christian canon. You open the book of Deuteronomy or 1 Samuel, and you run headfirst into a command that stops you cold. It's not a suggestion. It's a military directive from the creator of the universe to obliterate an entire civilization, men, women, children, and even the livestock. Total annihilation. For centuries, critics have weaponized these passages, waving them as absolute proof that the God of the Old Testament is a tribal, bloodthirsty warlord, utterly incompatible with the pacifist, loving image of Jesus in the New Testament. And if we are being honest, for millions of believers, this isn't just an academic debate. It is a crisis of faith. How do you reconcile a God of love with a God who commands a massacre? But what if the story we've all been told is fundamentally incomplete? What if, when you blow the dust off the ancient Near Eastern context and dig beneath the layers of Sunday school simplifications, you find a completely different narrative? We are looking at a theological cold case. The charge against the divine is genocide. The prosecution says it was arbitrary violence. But we need to look at the defense, because hidden in the dirt of archaeology and the nuance of Hebrew grammar is a story not of sudden anger, but of terrifying, almost confusing, patience. This is the file on the Canaanites that you were never shown. Our investigation does not begin with a sword. It begins with a clock that started ticking centuries before a single Israelite soldier ever stepped foot in the Promised Land. We have to rewind the tape to Genesis chapter 15. The scene is quiet, almost intimate. It's a conversation between God and a nomad named Abram, the man who would become Abraham. God is outlining the future of Abram's family. He promises them land, influence, a legacy as vast as the stars. But then the tone shifts. God drops a hammer. He reveals that before any of this glory happens, Abram's descendants will be enslaved in a foreign nation, Egypt, for 400 years. Why? Why would God hit the pause button on his own plan and let his chosen people suffer in chains for 4 centuries? The answer is found in Genesis 15:16. A verse that serves as the master key to this entire ethical dilemma. God says, "In the 4th generation, your descendants will come back here, for the sin of the Amorites has not yet reached its full measure." Stop and look at that phrasing. Not yet full. The Amorites, the dominant tribal group of Canaan, were already corrupt. They were already drifting into darkness. But God, in a display of restraint that is almost impossible for us to comprehend, says, "No, not yet." He was unwilling to execute judgment until the corruption had become absolute. This reframes the entire timeline. The 400 years of Israelite slavery in Egypt wasn't just about Israel. It was a grace period for Canaan. While the Israelites were making bricks under the whip of Pharaoh, God was giving the Canaanites generation after generation, century after century, to turn the ship around. It wasn't divine indifference. It was a divine countdown. God was holding back the dam of justice, waiting until the very last possible second. But that begs the question, what exactly were they doing that was so horrific it eventually demanded the death penalty for a whole culture? What does a society look like when its cup of iniquity is finally full? To understand the verdict, you have to stare directly at the crime scene. And it is ugly. The Bible doesn't just say the Canaanites were bad people. It gives us a forensic breakdown of a society in total moral collapse. In Leviticus chapter 18, just before the Israelites enter the land, God issues a spiritual quarantine. He lists a series of behaviors that are strictly forbidden, prefacing them with a chilling warning. Do not do as they do in the land of Canaan, where I am bringing you. The text then descends into a laundry list of depravity. It describes a culture where the sexual boundaries that hold a society together had completely dissolved. Incest, adultery, bestiality, These aren't presented as the crimes of a few outliers, but as the fabric of the culture itself. The Bible describes a society that had completely inverted the natural order, but sexual chaos was just the symptom. The disease was theological. The Canaanite religious system was built on transaction and manipulation. You didn't love Baal. You paid him. You performed rituals, often involving temple prostitution, to trigger the gods into sending rain and harvest. But there is one practice that stands above the rest, the one that seals the indictment. Leviticus 18:21, "You shall not give any of your children to offer them to Molech." This is the point of no return. Molech was a deity whose worship demanded the ultimate price. For a long time, skeptics argued that passing children through the fire was just a metaphor for a dedication ceremony. They said the Bible was exaggerating. Then, we started digging. While direct evidence in Canaan is debated, we look to their direct cultural cousins, the Phoenicians, who established colonies like Carthage. What archaeologists found in the Tophets, the sacred precincts of Carthage, is the stuff of nightmares. Thousands of urns. Inside them, the charred skeletal remains of neonates and young children. Inscriptions found alongside these urns read, "A vow that was paid." This wasn't a metaphor. This was a system where the most vulnerable humans were burned alive to buy favor from the gods. This is what the Bible means when it says the land vomited out its inhabitants. The text is using biological language. The society had become a pathogen. It was so toxic, so anti-life, that the earth itself was rejecting it like a body rejecting a virus. The waiting period was over. Now, a defense attorney might argue, objection, the Canaanites didn't know any better. They were ignorant. But the biblical narrative calls two surprise witnesses to the stand to shatter that argument. These witnesses prove that this wasn't a blind slaughter. It was a judgment where the escape hatch was left unlocked. Witness number one, Rahab. When Israelite spies infiltrate the fortress of Jericho, they don't find a population in the dark. They find Rahab, a prostitute running a lodging house, who tells them something shocking. She says, "We have heard." They knew. They knew about the Red Sea crossing. They knew about the destruction of the Egyptian army. She tells them, "Our hearts melted in fear." This proves that the intelligence regarding Yahweh's power had traveled across the desert. Rahab makes a calculated choice. She defects. She acknowledges the supremacy of Israel's God, and because of that, she is spared. She isn't just allowed to live. She is absorbed into the community of Israel, eventually becoming an ancestor of King David and Jesus himself. The genocide wasn't ethnic, it was ethical. If you turned, you lived. Witness number two, the Gibeonites. This is a fascinating political thriller in the middle of the war. The people of Gibeon, a major Canaanite city, realize they cannot win militarily. So they opt for espionage. They dress up in rags, load their donkeys with moldy bread and cracked wineskins, and trick Joshua into thinking they are travelers from a distant land. They swindle Israel into a peace treaty. When the lie is discovered, the Israelites are furious, but the treaty stands. The Gibeonites are spared. They become servants, woodcutters, and water carriers, but they are alive. Again, this complicates the narrative. It shows that the primary objective was the dismantling of the Canaanite system, not necessarily the extermination of every biological Canaanite. Those who sought mercy, even through deception, found a way to survive. But now we have to address the elephant in the room, or rather, the elephant in the dirt. The discrepancy between the Bible and the shovel. If you read the book of Joshua, specifically chapters 1 through 12, It reads like a blitzkrieg. City after city falls, totally destroyed, left no survivor. It sounds like a complete, sweeping conquest. But when archaeologists excavate sites like Jericho or Ai from the late Bronze Age, they often find nothing. No massive destruction layers that fit the timeline. Some cities appear to have been empty at the time. This has led many to conclude the Bible is pure mythology. However, the Bible actually offers a solution to this problem. If you keep reading past the victory lap, you have to look at the book of Judges. If Joshua is the highlight reel, Judges is the raw footage. And the raw footage is messy. In Judges chapter 1, the tone shifts dramatically. We get a list of failures. Manasseh did not drive out Bethshan. Ephraim did not drive out the Canaanites in Gezer. It's a catalog of incomplete missions. This suggests that the total destruction language in Joshua might be ancient Near Eastern war rhetoric, a kind of hyperbolic way of speaking common in that era. Like a sports team saying, "We absolutely annihilated them when they won 24-10. The reality described in Judges is one of slow infiltration, coexistence, and skirmishes. This aligns much more closely with the archaeological shift we see, where Canaanite culture slowly morphs into Israelite culture over time. The Bible isn't hiding the lack of total conquest. It's actually the main theme of the next book. The tragedy is that because the conquest was incomplete, the cultural infection remained. And this brings us to the final, terrifying why. Why was the command given in the first place? Why was God so adamant about this spiritual surgery? Deuteronomy 20 gives the diagnosis. Otherwise, they will teach you to follow all the detestable things they do in worshiping their gods, and you will sin against the Lord your God. It was a preemptive quarantine. God was building a kingdom of priests. He was creating a specific lineage, a cultural incubator from which the Messiah, the Savior of the entire world, would eventually be born. This plan was fragile. If Israel assimilated, if they absorbed the Canaanite addiction to idolatry and child sacrifice, the distinct moral monotheism needed to birth the Messiah would dissolve. The light would go out. History proves God's warning was accurate. The book of Judges documents the spiral. Israel didn't clear the land, and just as predicted, they started worshiping Baal. They started adopting the violence and the sexual brokenness of their neighbors. It led to centuries of misery, civil war, and eventually their own exile. God wasn't playing favorites. When Israel eventually became like the Canaanites, God used the Babylonians to vomit Israel out of the land, just as he had done to the Amorites. The standard was consistent. So, when we look at the destruction of nations in the Old Testament, we aren't looking at a temper tantrum. We are looking at a desperate, severe measure to preserve a lifeline for humanity. It was a surgical strike against a culture of death to protect the lineage of life. It's a hard truth, perhaps the hardest in the Bible, but it reveals a God who is willing to do the unthinkable to ensure that evil does not win forever. If you want to understand more about the historical context of these ancient wars or the specific archaeological finds mentioned here, hit that subscribe button. We are going to keep digging, but I want to turn this over to you. Does the quarantine hypothesis change how you view these difficult passages? Or does the moral weight of the violence still feel unresolved? Let's talk about it in the comments.